which is made even more awesome by the fact that Barb Lawton follows me. So what I say may be pre-climactic or something. At any rate, I'll say a couple of things to try to sum up how we might think about what we've heard and where we're headed. I want to spend a little time talking about theory. We've all heard theory these last 2 days. There's one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Deming. I have lots of them, but one of my favorite quotes is all theories are right in some world, which of course implies some theories are wrong in this world. I like just as much, perhaps even better, a statement by Dr. George Box, a statistician from University of Wisconsin, who said he used the word models, but I'll change it to theories. He means the same thing, and I know he agrees with me. All theories are wrong, but some are useful. He and Deming are saying the same thing. So in a manner of speaking, I can't say this on behalf of all the other speakers in the last 2 days. I'll certainly say it on behalf of myself. Everything you heard from me yesterday was wrong. But of all the wrong things I know, I selected those which I thought were most useful. And I think we should approach a day like today by considering that nothing you heard can be considered right for you until you apply it. And then make whatever adjustments to these theories you need to make in order to make them useful for you at home. I have one of my many unsuccessful efforts in life is to convince managers that they do not issue edicts so much as they are describing hypotheses, and that the appropriate response for their subordinates is to say, boss, nice theory. So when the boss storms in and says costs are out of control, the appropriate response should be, nice theory. Indulge me in this purely mental activity. I'm going to say part of a sentence. I want you to finish it. People do their best work when. I don't want to hear your answers. Just keep to yourself. Because everything you'd say would be a theory. Nice theories, folks. Whatever you thought in your mind, if your answer was in the afterlife, I would say, nice theory. And the point is, if managers could see themselves less as in control, less as issuing orders, and see themselves more as experimenters, where their theories need to be refined by research, data, looking for how well those theories apply to reality as well as we can do to discover what reality is, then we'd be better off. They'd be better off. Leadership would occur. Organizations would improve. Here's a scheme for you. Here I've got here I want to show correlation between assertiveness and truth. And theoretically, there should be a correlation here, right? That the less truth there is, the more assertive the speaker should be. But we know, in fact, that's not real life. You cannot tell by the assuredness of the tone of voice who's right and who's wrong. Generally, the assuredness of the tone of voice has something to do with how much clout the person has in the organization. So one of the things we have to learn how to do is to find tactful ways of saying to people who speak with an assured tone of voice, nice theory. Of course, which they might be reluctant to admit. But what we have learned from Dr. Deming is the importance of this dynamic. If our purpose is to learn or to gain knowledge, or for that matter, maybe this even works for having fun. Yeah, it does work for having fun. We're here to learn and to have fun. Well, you start out with a theory, a hunch about how it's going to work. Even a checklist, maybe. A checklist is a theory. When I get on a plane, I hope to God that the checklist is pretty close to truth. I hope there's nothing missing from the pilot's checklist. But you start out with a theory, and then you apply it. And from the application, you find out what there is that's inadequate about the theory, and you apply it, and so forth. And learning or knowledge is the interplay between theory and application. This is something that's, for any of you who have heard or read anything by Dr. Deming, this is not new. Without theory, there's no learning. Without application, there's no learning. It's the interplay between the two. So we are constantly trying to figure out, how do you explain this phenomenon? We come up with a theory, try it out, see if it works. If it doesn't, we come up with a new theory, try that out. Not disjointed theories, but we take what we learn and reformulate and adjust our theory. And the net result can be described this way. We plan what we're going to do. We do it. I want you to pay close attention to this. We study it. It's not that they convinced me, but I'm accommodating. And what was the most applause you got, Mr. Schultes? And then you act or adjust your theory and replan and do and study and act and plan and do and study and act. The plan, do, study, act cycle is nothing more than identifying the dynamics of learning and applying them to everyday life. So if you want to learn, you have to have a theory. And it's not that we are not lacking theories, it's just that we don't see them as theories. We see them as absolutely definitive explanations of what's going on. When you can start appreciating this, you can listen to something like a political convention, or you can read the front page of the paper, or listen to the pundits on television and the talk shows, and listen for how many theories there are floating around out there, though the speaker of them would never in the world acknowledge that that's what they are. They're treated as though they were absolute fact. And what kind of world would it be if we were to recognize theories as such and seek to find out what theories are true? But when people live in fear, they're not likely to say to their bosses, "Nice theory." Therefore, we won't have a means to measure what's true. We won't have a means to test out whether this theory is true or not, because if we want to survive in the organization, we have to just play the game. I want to say something else about, and I'm realizing that I have 30 minutes of time and about 10 minutes of presentation. Barb, get ready. You've probably heard about the person who wanted to find out the essential truth of the world and climbed up the Himalayas and got to the top and found this guru sitting in a cave and said, "Tell me the secret of life." And the guru said, "This too shall pass." And the guy said, "That's it?" Now, the fact is that something I think we have to keep in mind is that whatever is going on now shall pass. And especially when I become aware of those things that are happening that are discouraging, that are not consistent with what 10 years ago we all dreamed would happen, when I look at all of the fads and all of the profound stupidity that's going on in the world, I say, oh, gee. But what helped me as I surveyed history, the history I talked about yesterday morning, is that those things passed, and so will this. And we should not be surprised that there was a season in which this philosophy blossomed and that people moved on to other things. But there's an essential core truth to Dr. Deming's teachings. It's a primordial truth to Dr. Deming's teachings that will last. And people will come and go, and the crowds will get bigger, and the crowds will get smaller. But what will last is the truth of what he says. And one of the reasons it gives me hope is something that many of you who have seen me present have heard me present this. I just didn't bring a slide. It's from the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee tribe, there's a woman named Diani Uwahu. Don't ask me to spell it. Just trust me on this. Diani Uwahu is a woman appears to be in her 30s. She's the 26th generation of the Cherokee tribe that inherited the job of maintaining the Cherokee lore. She got it from her grandfather. I don't know why her father got bypassed, but that's probably just the way they do it. And she was one of the first, apparently, to write down Cherokee wisdom that was largely an oral tradition. And part of the wisdom was the definition, the Cherokee definition of successful work. And one part of the definition is really three components. It's clear intention. Clear intention, which pretty much explains itself. If you don't know what you're going to do, don't start doing it, because you won't know what you're up to and you won't know why you're doing it, nor will you, in Deming's words, be able to define the system necessary to accomplish it. You'll only confuse people. I would add to that, your intention ought to be something reasonably doable. Their other component of success is skillful means. When Dr. Deming would say, by what means, he's reflecting Cherokee wisdom, he probably taught it to them. And there's an interdependence between your intention and your means. If you don't know your intention, you won't know what means are appropriate. Dr. Deming said, without a purpose, there is no system. But this is primordial truth. This goes way back before writing was part of the Cherokee culture. And the third thing that was necessary is affirmation. And I'm drawing these kinds of arrows between them because this is a system of profound knowledge devised by the Cherokee tribe. Affirmation is not quite as self-evident as the other two. Affirmation says what you do has to be consistent with your values. It may be quite different than past practice, but it cannot violate the basic values of the tribe nor of your own heart. So it's a sense of integrity about what you do. If these three things are present, you will be successful. If you're missing any one of them, you won't be successful. And these three things interact with each other and are interdependent upon each other. It's a system of knowledge. To understand Dr. Deming's system of profound knowledge, it might be useful to look at other systems of knowledge. This is a system of knowledge that I would concede is also a system of profound knowledge. And in fact, you can see in there the sort of early version of Dr. Deming's system of profound knowledge. I'm moving so that those of you who had the screen blocked from me could see it. So we might substitute the word systems here, but it says the same thing. We might substitute the sense of cohesiveness in the group that's doing the work. We would use fancier words, but we wouldn't say much better than this. And it seems to me that when I talk about returning to some of the basics, I mean those things that have been true and will always be true as elaborated upon and taught to us by Dr. Deming. So I'm talking about, this is the last page of my notes that I used yesterday morning. So I would look for us to be able to maintain through all of this Dr. Deming's system of profound knowledge. Every day, just about, I grow in my admiration for this work and learn more about it. For me, it's something that just sort of sits in me and keeps working on me. Even when I'm not thinking about it, it's working on me. And all of a sudden, I'll see connections that I didn't see before, or see implications that I didn't see before. So this has got to be at the heart of what we continue to do. And then I also, as I mentioned yesterday, have a great respect for the importance of organizing for quality. And I mentioned here Juran and Ishikawa, and this is something that will continue to evolve depending on what more we learn about organizations. I especially appreciated Susan Leddick's description of some of the efforts that she's been involved in to do that. We cannot achieve what we're trying to achieve simply by wishing it to be so. It takes organization and careful, clever organization, well thought through, well planned, well led. And then Kurt Lewin's insights with regard to participation. The idea that if we don't involve the people of the organization, not only will what we come up with be less well thought through, but it'll end up probably being sort of perverse. We will end up hurting people. And we are, I hope, toward the tail end of an era of hurt, where people have been left out, locked out, dropped out, downsized, outsized, right-sized. Right-sized is a word I read this week. It describes the fact that when you downsize, most likely the smartest people are the ones that go. So we have been bright-sized. And if I have developed any kind of re-emerging idea for myself this last several months, it has been a sort of rediscovery and reaffirmation of the importance of participation. Participation is not enough. There's a system of things that need to be in place, and some of them are these that I'm talking about. And Tom Peters, for instance, got very attracted to the notion of participation, so he featured companies that had a lot of worker participation, but he didn't understand systems, so that was missing. In fact, most of the system of profound knowledge was missing from Tom Peters. And this is not a cheap shot at Tom Peters, it's just that he didn't know enough, and it probably explains why some of the companies he cited as examples of excellence did not succeed, and eventually why he gave up on quality and moved on to some other thing. Chaos. From which I predict he will never emerge. But I think he was right in his focus, for instance, on the importance of the customers. And I think he was right on his focus on the importance of participation. But he missed the point that these interact. These are part of an interacting system of knowledge and system of application. And then finally, McGregor and Hertzberg's assumptions about organizations and leadership, workers' motivation, and the enrichment of jobs in order to give people some kind of work that they can be proud of. And those of you who watched the interim video of Alfie Kohn talking about the difference between internal motivation and external motivation. Alfie is probably the most articulate and thorough teacher and researcher on the subject of motivation. I always learn from him too. What's exciting about conferences like this is the coming together of all these people who are learning constantly, and so that we can all learn from each other. I get as much from just casual discussions, people that you run into when they're on their way to the men's room, and you have a quick discussion because they're urgent to move on, but you learn a lot in those interchanges, or people you happen to sit down with at dinner, or people you happen to ride on the elevator with, or people whom you schedule to have a conversation with. All of this stuff is going on. It's almost as though as much learning takes place outside of these rooms as inside these rooms. But if we didn't have the things that happen inside these rooms, there would be, nobody would come, I suppose. And we even had fascinating discussions last night at the baseball game. And there weren't many distractions either. Certainly not on the field. It was our effort to prove to our British visitors that we have games just as boring as cricket. But the learning was taking place all over, and also the joy of hearing what people are talking about, the joy of listening to Susan Leddick, for instance, whom I've heard several times before, but I keep learning new things from her. The joy of listening to Barb Lawton, who's coming up within 30 seconds. Barb, are you ready? So it's impossible to capture all the learning, even capture all the learning that took place in these rooms, let alone the learning that took place everywhere else. But it's an exciting event. And whatever happens with OQPF, this is an event that will continue. So don't give up, persist, continue to have the passion that we've had the last couple of days and we'll have again tomorrow for the additional day. And the bad things that we're experiencing now will pass, and there will be new good things ahead. There's no reason to be anything but optimistic in spite of all the nasty things that are surrounding us. We'll be fine. I happen to live in Chicago during 2 riots. I didn't start them, I promise you. And it was in what would have been called by people not in the ghetto. People in the ghetto called it home. And there were riots right after Dr. King died. There was the second of the 2 riots. The first riot took place after a fire truck went down the street, and because the guy who usually runs the tiller, the steering wheel at the back of the hook and ladder, because he had been drinking and passed out, there was no tiller driver, and so as the fire truck went down the street, it swayed back and forth, ruining cars parked along the street. That caused a riot too. But what the people in the neighborhood knew is that while there was rioting and looting and burning and stuff going on over there or someplace else, the neighborhood stayed the same. People lived there, raised their kids went to school, stuff happened that would have happened any other day. The riots were scarier to the people not in the ghetto than the people who were in the ghetto. At any rate, it's sort of similar now. There's all sorts of weird stuff going on. It's our job, I think, to maintain the core, the continuous, steady core of truth that's part of this. And the only way we can do that is by keeping in touch with each other, coming to conferences like this, encouraging more people to come to conferences like this, allowing ourselves to learn more, to learn deeper, to think through the systems of profound knowledge and all the other systems of knowledge that we are exposed to that are worthwhile. And that'll continue even when the riots are over. The riots are over in Chicago. The neighborhoods remain. So on my behalf, and as the last sort of official announcement before the final speaker. I want to just say thanks for coming and keep on having fun and continue to learn. Now, I'm going to put a close to that, and I'm going to introduce Barb. Thanks. Barb Lawton is, I have my own version of what I appreciate about Barb Lawton, and I said a little bit about it yesterday. There are many of us who worked with Dr. Deming, appeared on stage with Dr. Deming, had chances to have conversations with Dr. Deming, but there are relatively few people who spent time working with Dr. Deming, helping him to evolve his message, and Barb is one of those. And while from Barb's point of view, we were talking the other day, Barb would say things like, but I could have done so much more. But from my point of view, I am eternally grateful that she did as much as she did. She and Nita Bakaitis and others. If I started to name names, I would unfairly disregard the others who were part of that group. Right now, Barb is at the University of Colorado in Boulder, professor of management. And she's part of, I might get this wrong, Barb, you can correct me when you get up here, but there's an ongoing Deming program, an integrated program focusing on quality with a strong emphasis on Deming's philosophy. It is for a training program for engineers. It includes a quality orientation that's part of everything, integrated curriculum. It's run by non-academicians, so people who are likely to be more tentative about their theories. It's a graduate program, and it's a distance ed program. You don't have to be on the campus of University of Colorado in Boulder, although why anybody would try to avoid that experience, I don't know. So Barbara is continuing some fascinating stuff, continuing to teach, and today she will continue to enlighten us all. So, Barb, come and help us finish the day. You're welcome.
Is mic on? Yes, we have mic. Great. Let me start off by saying it's a pleasure to be here, and I know everybody says that, but this is like coming home for me. This is the place that I come and get to play. Every year I look forward to coming to OQPF, and it's the one place I'm not with other academics who are, well, can you derive that? And can you show the analytical derivation of these pieces and parts? So this is a place for me to come and explore and share the things that are really exciting to me. So it's, let's do it. Let's have some fun. One other thing, just to start off with here, is that what you're going to find in your books, those overheads, well, there are some that'll match what I'm going to talk about. I had given that to Debbie Ray after, again, thinking about what I've done here in past years, which is dig deep into the science, and I was about to continue right where I left off last year. And I thought, after reading her letter that 50% of the people who are here haven't been here before, I had to think about that again. And so I'm going to talk about the same material, but I'll do it from a more business background, business position, rather than from a scientific position. I see some heads going like this already. Very good. So again, some of them you'll see there, some you won't. Another thing about 50% of the people being new, and something that Peter didn't say about me, is that I'm a statistician. And I can tell you the best joke that I know, and it's about statisticians. And you know about statisticians, don't you? Statisticians are people who like numbers, but they don't have the personality to be an accountant. I am one, so I can tell the joke. What I want to talk about today is building the future, the idea of where do we go forward, how do we go forward from here, etc. And what I'm going to be looking at is, again, the sciences. And when I say chaos, I really mean chaos as in chaos theory, complexity, that sort of thing. But we'll just talk about this sort of tangentially rather than directly head on. what in particular we'll focus on is the pattern of progress. So we've heard a lot in the whole conference about how change is with us, it's to stay, and we have to be adaptive to it, etc. Well, there's actually a pattern to it, and that's something that I think once we understand, we can begin to use. And I've had someone challenge me on this, and they said, who I've spoken to about this before, actually one of my students who was attending this conference at an earlier time said, well, I don't find this pattern particularly useful. And you can judge for yourself as we go along. But with this pattern, I guess I would think about it as the same thing as with common and special causes. Common and special causes, I would say, to know and understand what that is about. Well, you can't predict when it's going to happen and where it's going to happen and what's going to be the special cause or what's going to be the common cause. But once you understand the pattern of what's there, then you have an idea of what to do as a manager. You can begin to anticipate that this is what you will actually see. So we're going to talk about that type of pattern today, and that's something that chaos talks about as well. You cannot do deterministic prediction, but there are definitely patterns in what appears to be chaos. And so that's what we'll be talking about. And then finally, management implications is how we'll close. For those who have been here before, I'm going to use a graph that I've used before, history of progress and a story, which I think is important for two reasons. One is it sets a context for what we're going to talk about. And secondly, the pattern that we're going to see in this picture is the pattern that I want to talk about. So if you think about history of progress, and I mean progress for all of humankind, not just in the last 20 or 30 years. Well, humankind is about 50,000 years old, 40,000 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. And if you look at it and how we progressed over that time, well, the first wave, Alvin Toffler talks about this as well, he talks about the first pattern here, or wave, of human progress really came with the hunter-gatherer. Right? And now I draw this as covering a small portion of my axis because I want the rest to draw. But hunter-gatherer took us from, say, minus 50,000 years up to about maybe 10,000 years ago. So it really actually covers most of this axis that we were in this era and time. And eventually what happens is you start out here very early on, and you get growth. And where does growth come from? You think about this very early stage where you have a long, flat tail. And in here, what you're developing is tools and methods and practices. And where you really get to have growth is where you develop a system, I want to say a social system, a work system. Around these tools and methods, they include rituals, they include patterns of interaction. It's when you develop this structure in here, this infrastructure, a societal infrastructure, that it really takes off. But eventually, there's a limit to growth. How far can you go when you have to pick up and follow the herd of animals all the time? You can only grow so far. And then the animals move. Well, not only the animals move, but you also can begin to deplete the herd, so on and so forth. After hunter-gatherer, what's the next stage that we have? Those who have been here before, you know the answer. What is it? Agriculture, right. So you have agriculture. That's starting maybe 10,000 years ago. Same thing. You've got this topping out here and a very long, slow tail. Why is it slow, by the way? Oops, thank you. Why is it slow, the start slow? Learning. I mean, absolutely. You can begin to see and have an idea, a theory about, oh, seeds. You know, what happens is this plant drops seeds and that they go into the ground and then you can grow your own food that way. Well, it's just a theory for a very long time. And so you have a long, slow tail here before you develop tools and methods, and you develop a societal structure to go along with it. You have agriculture, takes you up a whole new path. And then eventually that tops out too. You can only go so far. There's only so much arable land, so much good land available. And at this topping out, you have wars between different countries over land, essentially. Because what the base here, the actual core resource at this point, again, is land. All right. That tops out after agricultural, and by the way, this is not just one time that it tops out. You'll have this happen, say, in South America, where you had agriculturally based societies, communities, etc. And now all you have left is traces of what was there. They did not make it through to the next stage. Tells you a little bit about this down curve, which may not be just a little down curve, right, but maybe a very large down curve. But the down curve you can begin to think about too. That's really a societal pressure, where there is a pressure for more, but yet you've reached the limit of the structure that you have in place. You have agricultural, the next one then being the industrial age. And here the key resource is machines. Physical plant, as you would call it in your balance sheets right now, right? Your assets, your list of assets, physical plant, etc. And then finally you have what I would call the knowledge age. And I know there's lots of different names for it, but the idea being that the key resource here is, again, knowledge. And so you start off real slow, developments of tools and methods. What do you have in here? You have total quality management. And let me back off on that for a sec. SPC, statistical process control. You have quality circles in here, right? You have Ishikawa diagrams. You have all these different tools along the way. And those tools are not about better machines, right? They're about using knowledge, what people have in their heads, to improve the way work is done and to improve the quality of the output, right? And what you have here then this is the knowledge age, the enabler. If the machines were the enabler here, the enablers here become actually computers, telecommunications. Right. So you have early tools along the way, and you try to start to build some infrastructure, and I would call that more TQM, right? Some infrastructure to support it. But we're still in the very early stages of this growth. Okay? So this becomes the pattern that we're looking at. What I want to talk about, and what we'll spend the afternoon on here, is looking at, again, these patterns, this S-curve pattern. And the reason is because the dynamics are so different depending upon where you are. And just like understanding special causes and common causes, if you understand the dynamics that are going on in each of these different stages along the way, you can anticipate it. You can prepare for it. You know how to use it. Think about the dynamic when you get to this hunter-gatherer at the very top, and you have here the chief of the tribe, right? And he's responsible for the tribe and the welfare of the tribe. What's the dynamic up here as you're at this top point and maybe even coming down the backside? Is it a nice, happy place to be? Probably not. It's like most of your organizations, I would say, right now. You look at healthcare, you look at education, what you have is a decrease in dollars, and yet you have more and more actually being asked of you. So it's a point of diminishing returns. This is not a pleasant place to be, right? And if you think about what this person often does, is they try to retreat to what they know best. They go back and they'd say, let's have faster hunters. We need to give them more skill. They just need to be more skillful in throwing that arrow, right? We need to be more efficient at skinning out the animal and saving up what we're going to eat out of it. So that's the dynamic at this point. But if you think about it and how they think about these people who are actually putting seeds in the ground, you know, those people that are putting seeds in the ground, they're probably described as airheads, all right? People who this is hopeless, this is ridiculous, why are you wasting your time and energy? You should be learning how to skin animals better, you know, that type of thing. Now, if the tribe was lucky, right, if the tribe was lucky, well, you know you have this tail here, you know you have a long period in which it's going to take to develop tools, methods, and which reflect knowledge to actually move forward. If the tribe was lucky, wouldn't it be nice if this fellow started all of this much earlier on? Maybe perhaps even in here, when the tribe was doing exceedingly well along the way, to start investing in the next curve. But what it takes is anticipation of the fact that you will reach a limit, right? That there is nothing that is stable and everlasting. As Peter had just said before, one thing we know is it's going to continue to change and continue to move, and we need to be able to move through forms. Okay, this is setting some context for it. Let's take a look then at the organization at any one point in time. So if you draw a point in time, say here, or perhaps maybe in here, anywhere along the way, how does the organization begin to operate? What you have here, how organizations work, this is the part that we see, okay? And again, for those people who have been here, you can actually go right along with me. You'll be almost sing along with me. Do a sing along on this. How organizations work, what we see when we go into organizations or communities, societies, anything of that nature, is what people are actually doing, behaviors, methods, and practices. And this is where we actually try to make change in, as Deming, what would I say? People with Deming insight, people who understand that the past is no longer going to work. When we try to make change, we try to make change here. And we have all the whole history of failure that went along with it. When we brought statistical process control over from Japan, and we spent millions and millions in training, and none of it worked. When you put QC, quality circles, in place, same thing, it doesn't work. And what you have is what people do here really depends upon the systems that drive this. Okay? The systems being your people, your work, and your managerial systems. These parts become important. Let's look at them again. People system. How do you develop people? Right? How do you hire them? How do you develop them? Who do you want them to be? What's their potential? Your work systems. This is based on the technology. What is the work that they actually need to do? Do you give skinning to one person and hunting to another, or does everybody do the exact same job? Managerial systems, how do you plan, how do you measure, how do you control, those sorts of things. This becomes your systems, and lastly, what you have then is if you try to work just at this level, as re-engineering did, we quickly find out that that fails, is that re-engineering of systems isn't enough. Can you imagine trying to re-engineer your reward system when you have a manager who's got a theory X attitude, or a theory X belief system? So it comes down to, what's the belief system, the organizational culture or paradigm? So if you've got a theory X manager down here and you come in and say, what we really need to do is get away from goals and incentives, etc., there's no way they are going to let you change what the systems are inside of the organization. So when you look at an organization as a whole, you have all three levels working simultaneously. This becomes the definition of what the organization is. It is itself a system operating together. So this is a system, and you have to look at all, it's a meta system in a sense, not just the work systems in here. What Deming talked about in Profound Knowledge is he really came out with the new ideas for, I would say, the knowledge age. You're looking at taking this picture, and as we move from here to here, what Deming had was, yes, he had statistical process control. That came more from Shewart along the way. But what you have is a change in how you see the world. And that's at that very bottom level of the iceberg. Okay? So what we've just sort of talked about, and although this isn't Deming's quote, I don't know what words he would use, but this is what he is essentially saying when he was consulting and in all of his teaching. How we see the world determines how we manage it, right? And there is a big shift between industrial age and knowledge age. The shift, I would say, in industrial era, you have the viewpoint being shaped by Newton and Darwin, right? And I'll talk about these both a little bit. And the technology that enabled it was machines. The Newton's view, if you think about this now, about systems again inside of your organization, let's look at this worldview, industrial worldview. When Susan Leddick had asked you to describe what you thought of in terms of this industrial age view, what your worldview is. I think of it as actually thinking about people the same way we think about machines, again, shaped by Newton. A machine is static. It doesn't improve itself. Think about a car. You're very happy when it's stable, and it keeps on running the same way it did when it was new, right? So any change that you have is actually degenerative. Change is degenerative. Your car, when it's brand new, runs best, and after a while, it starts to degenerate. Some of these you'll recognize whole is equal to the sum of the parts. Okay? It's also, the whole is therefore knowable and controllable along the way. You break it down into parts, and all of the parts are knowable and controllable. When something breaks, what happens, or it doesn't work, you identify and replace the broken part. Have you been a broken part? I hope not. Has your department been a broken part inside of your organization? Oh, the MIS system or the MIS guys, this doesn't work, let's get rid of them. We just bring in a new part, right? We just replace the part. Do the same thing with people. The thing about machines as well is that they can and must be managed. It's a belief system that they have to be managed. And we have the same thing about people, very much theory X. They can and must be managed. They must be managed because machines require external energy. You have to plug it into the wall, you have to put gas into it, you have to put a battery into it, right? Well, external energy for people is that manager who's giving that extrinsic motivation, okay? So it's the same idea. In a machine, you've got interchangeable cogs. Everyone's just interchangeable along the way. Important characteristics are measurable inside of a machine. And when you start to look at this, interchangeable cogs, important characteristics are measurable, it's knowable and controllable, then you start to say, oh, quality, well, we can specify that with no problem. I want to say, think about job specifications here too. And finally, when you can specify everything, then you go to acquisition by lowest bid, including hiring people, right? Who can we get for the least amount of money to come in and do this cog job? Not looking for the best candidate, but again, with a given set of specifications, lowest price. Improvement comes through competition, and which one is better than the other? And finally, bigger is better. Now, when you think about this, and you say, what are the systems? Again, the managerial systems that we put in place that actually reflect this. This is inside your organizations. So far, so good? Yeah? One more. And I said that it was both Newton and Darwin. And it's interesting because there's been lots of controversy, or not, I wouldn't say controversy, discussion about Darwin here over the last couple of days. Perhaps not from the podium so much as just in general conversation. But Darwin started out with this idea of survival of the fittest, right? And that's, in a sense, true. We'll talk about it. What does it mean? How is it true and how is it not true? The way it's not true is the way that we have come to interpret it and carried it down through history. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Do you know what that means? Okay, your teeth are red and your claws are red. Why are they red? Because you've just gone out and killed your competitor. This is a war model. It's a model of war. So survival and evolution is driven through war and competition. And this is what they mean by what is meant and being carried through by survival of the fittest. So again, what we look at is in terms of the industrial era, we have this piece in here being driven by machines with a machine age view, and also Darwin there in terms of how you actually make improvement, right? It's the species are there, and now what you do is you essentially weed out the weak ones. This weeds out the weak ones along the way. Systems and processes then, these are often the target of our work. I want to say that they've got two sides to it that we have to recall, because it's, again, you're the person who's going to be creating or trying to change systems. Systems, on one hand, their early role, they capture and they share learning. So when you figured out how to do something, don't you go to your colleague and say, well, let me show you what I've learned. You create a process or a system to share learning. Okay? It's a way to begin to do that. It increases efficiency, reduces ambiguity, and this way you have free energy left over, not to figure out and solve the same problem everybody else did, but you have free energy left over to actually improve. So in the beginning, systems and processes are our servants. We create them to serve us. Later on, what happens is that they begin to restrict our choices. And this also works very much with this S-curve as well. Think about the very early portion of this curve. You create systems and processes to share what you have just learned along the way. When you get to the top, it constrains what you can do. So at the top, the late role, it restricts choices. You have unnecessary complexity because these systems were developed in the past, may no longer be useful. It lengthens the time to accomplish the task, and they're resistant to change. And in their late role, we serve them. Right? And you see this perhaps in even your own situation with ISO 9000. As I work with companies that have been involved with ISO 9000, they first say, wow, this is really neat. Actually, we didn't know about all these things, and we didn't share all this information and knowledge. And eventually what happens is ISO 9000 becomes this. Right? It restricts their choices, and we become servants to the system. So it's one system that's probably, again, familiar to most of you. ISO 9000 involvement? Not that many. That's actually good. 20%, maybe. Okay. What Deming did, and where we're going to follow on today, and this is, again, mostly by way of introduction, now what we're going to do is go back and take a look at this beginning, at this very low end to the iceberg, and say that this is what Deming's contribution was, is he gave us a new way to begin to look at things. We don't necessarily have all the behaviors, methods, and practices down. We're still in the very early portion of that curve, and we don't know what the systems are going to look like either. We're all on that path of experimentation. And with this profound knowledge, some of the key aspects of it being that we have appreciation for a system, we consider aim and interdependence, we understand variation, knowledge, and finally in terms of psychology about cooperation versus competition. There's one other thing that I want to add to this, and for myself. As I look at it, the piece that was missing for me along the way, and it's again tangential or coming off of what we talked about last year, is the idea of change. We've heard about change continually over the last couple of days, and how what we're doing now isn't going to last. Well, what does this tell us about change? And that's where I found the other sciences to be so helpful. When I think about thermodynamics and chaos theory, those two in particular, that's the source that works most for me. So if I look at this, here are the principles that we'll talk about. So in addition to this knowledge age view, I want to say that the world is continually evolving. Well, that's probably no news to you. At an ever-increasing rate, probably again fits with your experience. Guess what? Thermodynamics confirms it. So does chaos theory. At least the thermodynamics confirms this. And then what does it mean for us? And that's the piece that we'll work on here. This first part about world is continually evolving and at an ever-increasing rate. I want to say what that means is that this is a creationist world. What I mean by creationist, I don't mean any religious connotation to this at all. Creationist is that we start out when we think about Newton with change as being degenerative. We think about entropy, the system running down, right? And actually, it's quite the reverse of that. It's what you have here, creationist world. The laws of entropy still hold, but what we have now is different understanding of them. And in brief, let me try a little snapshot on it. So if you think about the Big Bang, right? Huge, huge energy source beyond any of our imaginations, right? And what that does is create a pressure for energy to flow. Energy wants to dissipate, move out, because it's all so concentrated. A pressure to flow, and therefore increase entropy. What does entropy mean? Real quick for lay people, entropy is when, well, you cannot use up energy. You have conservation of energy. But what you can do is redistribute it. When you have energy that is very highly concentrated, you've got a potential workforce for you there, a potential force to do work. What happens with entropy is that all that energy gets completely spread out. It becomes, I won't say even, and you lose the potential to do work. So when energy is no longer concentrated, you've lost the potential to do work, right? Well, what happens with the Big Bang, or when you have an energy source like that, think about it. Energy, again, wanting to flow and dissipate. If you have a campfire and you want to dissipate at the end of your meal and the end of your stay, you want to dissipate that energy. You want to put the campfire out, right? Well, it's a lot more effective if you have actually had coals there to begin with. If you had coals, what do? You separate out the coals away from each other, and you can dissipate the energy faster. that way, right? That's what solar systems are. Solar systems essentially, and that's very loose, but essentially that's the role or function in a synthesis framework that Susan Lettick talked about. That's the role or function of a solar system. Essentially, it's to separate out and allow energy to move faster. So it will form the structure. You will get formation of a solar system, because what it does is it enables the energy to dissipate faster. Structure, organization, moves energy through faster. Same thing that a tornado does. This is your Chaos 101, okay? Chaos 101, what does a tornado do? It's the same thing. You have this tremendous potential energy up in the sky. How do you dissipate it? The most effective way to dissipate it is through organization. A tornado quickly dissipates or equilibrates, comes to equilibrium, the energy in the sky versus the energy that you've got down below, right? So what you have is that this pattern here that we talked about at the beginning, this isn't an anomaly. This is the way of the universe. It is creationist, and that it creates organization. It creates cells, it creates life, it creates human organization because it is more effective at moving energy through. Okay. Do you have it? It takes a while. It took a while for me to begin to understand something that where you're taught, well, life is an anomaly. Don't worry about life. It's on the side, right? And no, life isn't. It actually is the pattern, and this is what we're talking about, is using the inherent patterns in the universe, understanding them, and beginning to then plan with and work with them. So this is a natural pattern. You might have here the formation early on of a single cell. And when you go, wow, single cell moves energy through faster. Now we're looking at just our sun. We want to dissipate that energy. You move energy through faster through a cell than you do through random collision of molecules, just random collision of molecules, okay? So what you've got here is once you've got the invention of a cell, you would have rapid growth. Replicate it. Let's replicate this baby. And you try and you use it as much as you possibly can, and then you hit the limit to what it can actually do. Right? And then you go on again and say, well, what's the next invention that you can begin to create? So if you look at this, and we go back to this idea of a creationist world, as in creating structure, creating organization, creating life. We also have here, and the world is continually evolving at an ever-increasing rate. Here's one picture. This is in your book. One of my colleagues, Sally Gerner, wrote the book I wish I had written in my life, okay, called Chaos in the Evolving Ecological Universe. Pulls all this hairy science stuff together. But it's just a picture. If you look at how old the Earth is, and let's say 5 billion years old, something, or life is, not Earth, but life is, 4 to 5 billion years old. What you have here is, in the beginning, it takes, a couple of billion years before you get the development of a one chromosome cell. Now, how many do you have as humans? They're like 96 chromosomes or something like that. It takes, a couple of billion years to get a one chromosome cell. Then it takes another billion to get multi-chromosome cells. And then it takes less than that yet to get to multicellular organisms. And finally, you have here unit family, multifamily society, society of state. It just all happens. It's accelerating the rate at which it actually begins to move. The point that I want you to carry away from this, okay, in this discussion, is these two things. Is that structures and organization, they form naturally. If we did nothing, if we kind of fell off the face of the earth, life would continue on, and you'd still get continued evolution, and it would be at an ever-increasing rate, right? If that's a given, why don't we work with it? Okay. Well, the same thing happens, actually, you see that even in human organizations, human invention. What is it? Something like, in the last 50 years, we've invented more than all of mankind has before that. And every 7 years, the knowledge in the world doubles, those sorts of things. So you see the same thing in terms of human invention as well. Okay, so that's the basic pattern. part of this then, progress then comes through a series of S-curves. Okay? And this is not the science talk I was going to give either. So, the series of S-curves. Here we have a pattern, long periods of stable sameness, and you probably have this one in there. Long periods of stable sameness punctuated by abrupt transitions. You may recognize this from chaos theory as well. It is not just this nice linear system, stable state. You have abrupt transitions to qualitatively different states. What do I mean by this? What's abrupt? You have a specific threshold. For example, ice to water to steam. At 32 degrees, if we're using Fahrenheit, we go from ice to water. Okay? At exactly, 212 degrees, you go from water to steam. Thank you. Water to steam. This is what we mean by abrupt. What is transformation here? Transformation, though, isn't instantaneous. Okay? Think about this in terms of even your own organizations. Transformation isn't instantaneous. Okay? This will be, you have a chunk of ice, put it into your glass of water, and yes, it will melt. It will change states from one to the other, but it takes time to work all the way through that. Right? So what we mean by these S-curves is you've got a transformation going on here from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, but it takes time as you're going through. It's going to be the same thing from here to here, and it takes time. And there'll be even periods where it moves backwards a little bit because of local gradients. You can have it swing backwards a little bit, right? And so when we're moving through here ourselves inside our own organizations, that's something we probably personally experience at times where it moves backwards because of local gradients. But we're making this change and we're moving forward, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen one way or another. Now, whether or not it happens in the United States, whether we decide not all civilizations survive, and I think Deming had a real cute little quote about that. He said survival isn't necessary. It's not mandatory. Survival is not mandatory, right? Well, how do we then make it so that we move through this transformation along the way? The dynamic, each cycle improves, reaches its limits of its current form, and creates new conditions. This is a big deal. Creates new conditions. We've talked about each cycle improving, reaching its limit of its current form. You can't go any further in a hunter-gatherer mode. You can't go any further in an agricultural mode, right? Actually, you create new conditions, so you can't go backwards. You just can't go backwards on this. You've created a new set of circumstances that the only way forward, the only way to move is forward, actually going forward through this. The pattern accelerates, we've talked about that. And lastly, each cycle builds on previous cycles. The point being here, when you go from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, does hunting and gathering disappear? Does agriculture, when we move from agricultural to industrial, does it disappear? In fact, it's still there. It, in a sense, becomes marginalized. Right? It becomes less important. It's less dominant. But each cycle builds on previous cycles, and as we move into this knowledge age, this will still be there. The industrial component will always still be there. And there'll be different ways of looking at it and managing it, but this will, be there. So it builds one after the next. It was interesting, I think it was Peter, on the very first day, talked about how we went over to Japan and tried to take quality circles and bring them over here and just put them in place over here, where they had had 13 years of experience before us. They had used SPC, and they built the foundation to move to the next level. And here we just try to transplant it and move it over. So you have to build that foundation before you can actually go to the next level, too. Okay. So we've got this pattern, then, of moving successive S-curves. And what I want to talk about in here a little bit further is the dynamics that are going on in each one of these different stages, because it really will change what leadership is about in all of these different stages. Look at development. I thought first let me look at an example of this S-curve. First example, the telephone, right? And it's a human invention, but you could pick this, you could take this and you could look at it on societal level, you could look at it on an invention level, et cetera, individual invention, or actually on a more global sense, and that's the fractal concept in chaos, that the same pattern will repeat itself. A fractal being, for example, a snowflake, right? You have the same little pattern in one molecule, in a sense, or one little piece, as you have throughout the entire snowflake. It's, again, a fractal concept. So this S-curve concept is a fractal concept. Development of the telephone, this being the very first stage, you first have an invention in early 1890. But if you think about when the telephone actually was first used, I believe it was New York City where it was first used, and it took almost 20 years before you had a telephone system. You know, why does that happen? Why does it take 20 years? You've got an invention, wow, something neat and new, but you've got to build the whole foundation for it before it can play a coherent role in the web. This is going to be a real important piece in all of this, so it'll be italicized just about every time that I use it. Play a coherent role in the web. Right now, we have an invention of a telephone. Well, before you can get energy moving through that, before it can actually begin to take this pent-up desire to communicate amongst people, you've got to create a system. I mean, a system from start to finish that will allow you to utilize that invention. You have time here to develop an infrastructure. Well, we've got to make phones. We have to have phone lines. Well, with phone lines, actually, they piggybacked off of the telegraph. And if you didn't have the telegraph, you wouldn't have had the telephone in 10 to 20 years. It might have been 30 or 40 years before you had the telephone. Okay? So you have to build an entire infrastructure in here, a subscriber base. What would it be like to have a telephone with nobody else to call? Okay? You've got to have a subscriber base. You have to have a service, someone who will interconnect you. And so this development stage is all about one of, I want to say, diversity, invention along the way. And the only way that it will take off, though, is if you pull a whole system together so that it can play a coherent role in the web. I want to say this also about Deming's philosophy. Here we almost had an invention, right? This is something that's brand new, but how come it's never really been adopted and picked up and used? I want to say that I think what we haven't successfully done is create an entire system so that it can play a coherent role in the web. I'd say Durand came closer to it so that organizations have a need, which is, we need someone to come in and help us, right? And here is Durand who says, great, not only do I have an idea, I'll develop an infrastructure and all the pieces and parts that are necessary to support it and enable it to play a role in the web. That's what the people who are very good at commercializing do, right? So Tom Peters as an example. Doesn't mean you have good content, but it means that they knew how to make it play a coherent role in the web. All right, that's the development stage. Once you've got this, then you've got growth. And if you look at this, growth is one of replication. It took about 50 plus years till you had widespread, reliable service throughout the United States. Okay? And this is a growth and replication issue. It's an infrastructure issue along the way. Susan talked about this again as well earlier today, is you need an infrastructure to begin to replicate it, to enable it to grow. And finally, I think this one really should go down in this end. When you hit the topping out, a couple of different things are happening. Well, the top out, this invention particularly starts to top out. Everybody's got one line per house. Well, maybe some people will want to, okay? You have a bandwidth issue in terms of, well, we want to get our VCR and our cable and our TVs and our computers. Well, there's a bandwidth issue with single plain old copper wire. So that sort of limits the growth of what's going on. And portability. People want to have phones with them all the time, so you have a limit to this invention. When you have this topping out, this is where you get the increasing efficiency, decreasing cost, industry consolidation. So I'm sorry, this really belongs down here. And we'll talk about this all the way through. Yes, it is. This would be more in a transition moving into here, right? question was, is it in both places? And yes, this does belong sort of at the top end of this, moving in here. All right, so that's the three stages of this, and we'll do this in detail here in just a moment to talk about these three different stages and what the inside of the organization is like as you're beginning to do this. When you think about successive S-curves, this is again the pattern of progress, one building on top of the other. What you have here is increasing intricacy. Now the chaos people would say complexity, but complexity is a word that we often use in the quality community as bad. Something is too complex, simplify it, right? So let me use the word intricacy instead to say that what you have is increasing intricacy and that gives you interdependence, right? Let's take an example and walk through it. As you move, if you have growth, if you've got this driving force, which is our sun, and it's just driving, and it's going to be there for as long as we're around, probably. I'd bet money on that one. So you have the sun that's driving growth and increasing organization. Let's say you have here one person who has this parcel of land. Let's say this is the only arable land that I can grow things on. Well, you have person number 2 who comes along. This is the only parcel of land that you can grow things on. Well, what we're going to do, we'll share it. Okay, divide it in half. I'll work this half, you work this half. Well, you continue to have growth. You still have growth and replication. That is a natural process that's going on. Growth and replication, you have more people showing up. And what you wind up doing is beginning to divide the proverbial pie up, right? Each person beginning to work or working their piece. What they are doing is they are actually growing their own food. They have their own, providing their own shelter, their own clothing. Okay, each one being totally independent of the other. Right? What happens when this population keeps on growing and this gets tighter and tighter and smaller until this fellow is left on this little tiny piece like this? You're reaching that topping out phase, right? And you have real pressure, again, to do something different, to either go out and fight with each other. This is the model, this is Darwin's model of competition, of survival of the fittest. It is killing off, red in tooth and claw, your neighbor. It's the way we've carried the idea of competition into our own thinking. Well, what would be a better thing to do here is the dynamic that we've got in this situation, the dynamic is one of competition. The solution to move to the next S-curve, right, is specialization. Right? Specialization would be, this fellow says, tell you what, you're really good at doing shelter over here, and I'm really great at growing. Why don't we put you in charge of shelter and I'll do the growing, right? I've created, though, interdependence in doing it. So specialization, as we've thought about it, is sometimes we think of as bad. We say, no, we're not going to be specialists, we're going to be generalists. We still need to be specialists. All of progress depends upon minute differences between individuals, or differences between individuals that you can leverage. And then I want to say, this is no longer competition, it's the direct opposite of that. It is actually what we'll call coupling. Coupling being a true commitment to each other. And it's essentially what happens inside the human body, or any organism, is that you, right now, if you had to go out and grow your own food, build your own shelter, make your own clothes, I think I'd give you a low 6 probability of survival, okay? If each of you had to do that. You are now thoroughly interdependent and dependent on everyone else in the system, okay? So progress, as you're going through, actually increases intricacy, specialization becomes, and differentiation, specialization, is the actual dynamic that's going on, and then coupling coming together. Right? I don't know. Yes, no, maybe? Questions? Let me just take a question first, if there is one here, because this is a really important point. Okay, it's as you're going through this curve, it almost seems counterintuitive that as you're going through any one of these points and you're topping out, and you're just, the first reaction being to compete with each other, it's the opposite reaction that's actually going to get you out of it, right? It is through specialization, finding differences, creating differences, and then taking advantage of those differences, but it creates interdependence. So as you move through this curve, you're getting increasing specialization, increasing intricacy, increasing interdependence all the way through. And you can almost see what's happened to us in the United States. You get to the top of this curve here, we're pushing for efficiency, which we get through standardization, right? We're pushing for efficiency, standardization. And what we do is push out the thing that's actually going to move us from one curve to the next. Okay? So that's why I think it becomes important to understand the dynamics that are going on as we go through this thing. So what we have is increasing intricacy and interdependence. You have it in biological systems, you have it in human societies. It's built upon the foundation of previous stages. You need what you've just done. You can't just throw it away, say it was all wrong and bad. You build on what you've done before. And you have actually, every time you do this, you have greater opportunity for innovation. The more specialization that you have in here, as this parcel of land, which you can call the Earth, if you want, right? As the population keeps on going up, what you do is get more intricacy along the way, and then what you have is different centers for diversity. Well, here I am building shelters. Well, if I do something a little bit different, or somebody else does something a little bit different, we actually get growth and diversity coming out of here. We have, out of the growing region, growth and diversity coming out of here. So as it gets more complex, you actually go faster. Right? You actually have this opportunity to create more and new things. You're doing a great job at hanging in there. I could tell from your faces. It's the first time I'm talking about this, so thanks for working with me. Let's look at the individual stages as we go along. The development then, in that development stage, that very early stage, if you're thinking about planting seeds in the ground here, all you're trying to do is really be successful, survival at this point in time, right? Real short-term focus, right? Not real outcome-oriented. Can we get a plant to come up from the ground next year? It's all we care. I don't care what it takes to do it. I don't care, right? It's a very short-term, outcome-oriented time. It comes through specialization and coupling in terms of these dynamics. And what happens here is if you're going to go back to our little planet Earth, one person grows, another one does shelter, and now you are totally dependent upon this other person. I don't want to talk about symbiosis. I want to talk about mutualism. Mutualism is actually where you support and nurture and enable one another. You invest in the other person. You invest in their capabilities. You invest in their differences. Symbiosis is when what I'm doing benefits you and what you're doing benefits me, but it isn't this active investment in each other. It isn't in diversity, okay? So you have here mutualist. And with this, by the way, when you have this real tight need to survive, we're going to try our own little tribe here, our own little company. Think of a startup company. And you want it to just survive. Can we get enough money in to make this month's payroll? I mean, that's the first issue. If you've been in a startup, anybody here ever in a startup? Oh, that's a good number. Okay, well, then you could probably tell the story. I know you could tell the story better than I can. It's just that's what your first instincts are. And the group is so attuned to it, the whole group, you have real strong group learning, not just individual learning. Okay. Remember Peter talked about, just before he introduced me, he said where he did his learning, conversations, walking to the men's room, okay? So much of our learning, our group learning, comes through collaboration and through conversation as much as it does through anything else. And so that's what's going on here. This is full inclusion, and not just involvement, it is commitment. You are making a commitment, actually putting your own survival, maybe economic survival, on the line at a particular point. This time also has a high failure rate, right? It's interesting when you look back at an S-curve, you look back at an S-curve and you can say, oh yes, well, we saw this invention and this is how it followed all the way through. What you don't see is all the failures, tons and tons of failures, okay, at this point in time. High failure rate and very inefficient. The transition, when you finally can maybe take a sigh of relief along the way, you have a transition to the growth phase when you finally have a viable path, an entire viable path. So you have an idea of a particular type of service that you want to provide to your customer. You need a viable path from start to finish, from suppliers, your piece on it, any other coupling that you've done along the way, how do you deliver it to the customer? A whole complete path. And that's, again, I think that this is some of what Deming was not very good at. Right? He was great in the development stage, and he had great ideas, but I don't know that we ever really developed a viable path, if I want to go back and sort of look at it and try to explain why this never took off as much as it could have, or we would hope it would. Viable path, and it plays a coherent role in the web so that you get positive feedback. And I want to say positive feedback is not more money or a paycheck. Excuse me. That's, I said that backwards, sorry. I mean positive feedback as in very good and just a acknowledgement. You actually need energy flowing through your system, right? You need dollars, money flowing through your system so you can build infrastructure to go into the next stage. So this is the, yes? A role in the web. An organism would not survive if it was not actually playing some important role. Let's say an important role would be actually the detritus feeders, the ones that take the leaves, decompose them, and then release the nutrients into the ground. It plays a coherent role in this larger cycle of the rejuvenation of nature, okay? So it's the same thing here. If you had a consulting service for education, it wouldn't be until you played a coherent role in the entire larger system of education that I would say, okay, your survival is now almost guaranteed and you're going to go into a growth phase, okay? So you've got to be playing this role, and it's the synthesis side instead of the analysis side. What's the role that you're going to play in this larger system so that people will invest in you, okay? Good question, thank you. This becomes the development part. The growth part, or the growth and acceleration, here the aim is really just growth and replication. I've got demand. I've got more demand than I know what to do with. How do I actually begin to grow this? The dynamic here then is maximizing your positive feedback along the way, and it becomes a competition. We said before it was mutualist, right? Now you're coming into competition, but it's competition to serve the web better. Let me give an example of this. If you have a couple of them, you got VHS versus beta. Remember that? Beta was supposed to actually be better technology. VHS got out there first. And through positive feedback, you have VHS. Positive feedback being, well, geez, more people are using VHS. I guess I better put this in VHS format and build VHS machines. And it's like a treadmill. You walk on it, you start it, you get it going, but eventually the momentum that you build up carries you along. Same thing with, I want to say, Microsoft Office versus, some people are familiar with these things, Microsoft Office. Supposedly, WordPerfect is better than Microsoft Word. Supposedly, the Lotus spreadsheet is better than the Excel spreadsheet, okay? Why does Microsoft Office then, why is that the one that's growing and WordPerfect and Lotus spreadsheet going down? It's because they were out there first in terms of their capacity to serve the web. So Microsoft Office tries to, even gives their product away. It even gives their product away just so that you will use it. And the people who developed other software programs say, oh, well, Microsoft Office is the dominant one. We better make it compatible with this. Right? So you're trying to build a momentum in here, and it's this positive feedback loop. So you're looking at competition to serve the web, who can serve it, play that role better, faster, all of those things. You're looking at increasing capacity and maximizing your positive feedback. The focus now, before, short-term oriented, survival, immediate, just outcome oriented. Here it begins to shift. Here you start looking at a longer-term focus. You're looking more at process orientation, because what's the limit to how much you'll grow depends on your ability to serve the web. It's a capacity, a large part, a capacity issue. Okay? You're putting on lots of infrastructure here. You're building an infrastructure to support that growth. You have to, otherwise you have true chaos, like the way we experience it. Rather than the science, it's more like we experience it. And what happens here too is we're in the very beginning in a small company or in a small group, little band of settlers moving out west, right? This little band of settlers closely in tune with the external environment. What happens here is you build infrastructure, you start to get an internal focus. The dynamic shifts from the outside to the inside. What's the world that you know? Think of your organization and where you're coming from. The dynamic was probably mostly internal. Okay? You thought of your group inside this larger organization, but you didn't think about the external world you were serving. You didn't think about the role you played in this larger web, right? So the dynamic and the whole focus starts to shift in here along the way. Yes? Question, what do you do when you get to the upper carrying capacity of the Earth? And let me answer this one first. In a sense, we may have reached that several different times over already through different technologies. Each technology increases the carrying capacity of the Earth, okay, in a sense, is what we're doing. Question? Right, right. You're creating a new curve every time you create new technology. So this is what you're beginning to do. The dynamics of growth, the transition here is when you're in this growth phase, invention continues, as it always has, but it's basically unheeded. It's not paid attention to, okay? It becomes, whatever your invention is, let me say telephone becomes, and I'm jumping back and forth, and I hope this is working for you okay, between social organizations and inventions. We could do the same thing with biological structures. It's the same pattern that repeats. It becomes densely and finally embedded in the web. So telephone, well, at one point it was, wow, this new invention. Everything was based off of telegraph and off of letters. Now telephone is no longer this wow new invention. We don't even think about it. It has just become part of it. And so you have the proliferation of whatever it is actually changes the environment. It drains the demand for whatever it is, your product or your service that you're putting out. It changes the value of the existing service. So before, when you think about what the cost of the telephone might have been when it was first introduced, I have no idea what it might have been, but I would guarantee you it's expensive. It's like the first calculator. Were you one of those kids in college that had the calculator where everybody else was still working with the slide rule, right? And if you remember those first calculators, $300 to do something that added and divided. And that was it. Well, now it does this. It changes the value of the existing service, and it shapes what will be valued next. Okay? So it builds one after the other. And it's a path that, who knows, this is not predetermined. These paths are not predetermined. There is no central brain cell, or if it is, and if there is some entity out there that has this, we don't see it, I don't see it, okay? This can change and go in any direction at any time based on what we do along the way. Oops. There it is. Management and leadership, actually in here they're building structure. They often get lost in their own success along the way. We have here, in this growth period, this comes back to this very early stage here, this growth period in here. This would be the time, if we were smart, to be investing and tinkering out here on the next, regarding the next wave, if you will. And if you push for maximum efficiency in here, what you do is actually drive out what's going to lead you to the next level. And so if you drive for that bottom line, if you drive for perfect performance, zero waste, this is waste when you're looking at hunter-gatherer here, right? Planting seeds in the ground, that's waste at this point in time. So you're looking at, you need to be thinking about and looking ahead, because you'll be otherwise fall into the trap that we've fallen into before. So it should be investing in the largesse into the next round of invention. Topping out, we come back again to a matter of survival. What you have is a decreasing growth rate, and whatever your invention was, if it were a biological invention, it would be the ability to breathe air, because we all started in the water. Or perhaps it was sprouting wings. Right? Once it's deeply embedded in the web, if for human systems, it goes from something that satisfies you to something that dissatisfies you if you don't have it, like the telephone. Right? You expect a certain level of service. So this even ties into our quality management, thinking about this as well. It becomes a dissatisfier. It's marginalized in terms of its importance. Once something that seemed very important before is no longer very important. I want to say that this even happens with Deming's ideas becoming marginalized right now, not because they've topped out in terms of potential, but because they've topped out in terms of application, in terms of how we know how to apply it. Is that it's and especially I want to say quality. Quality was a great satisfier, like capital Q quality in organizations. Now, if you don't have it, that's more of a dissatisfier. You have to have your ISO 9000 registration, okay, that type of thing. It's become marginalized. In here, the other things that are going on is you have increasing capability. What you were doing before, it took a lot of energy invested to create a small amount. But with increasing efficiency, with increasing knowledge, you actually increase your capability. And in this topping out stage, you wind up with too much infrastructure. You put all this infrastructure on for growth, you've got all this increasing capability, now you've got too much infrastructure, and possibly, probably, even the wrong infrastructure. Okay? Because it was infrastructure from a different time in a different place. So as we were talking about, and Susan was talking about changing your organization every 3 years, well, there's real need to begin to do that, because this is a pattern that repeats itself over and over again. And you have here decreasing efficiency because you've got increased capability and too much infrastructure. You just don't need as much to do as much. And this is where Chainsaw Al comes in, right? At the top. And is in this situation. But if you don't anticipate this situation yourself, that's essentially what you wind up with. Let's keep going here. I'll come back to Chainsaw Al and actually moving from topping out to the next stage here shortly. There's a couple of other things I wanted to say in here. And this goes more to social systems, because the same thing happens in social systems. We've talked about this industry consolidation, et cetera. You get internal insularity and entitlement. You've got this big organization. You have AT&T, you have IBM, right? You've got General Motors, some of the big companies. And they become, with this specialization that you have and this intricacy, in the very beginning, all of these groups, one working on shelter, one working on growing food, very tightly connected to each other. What happens is as you get growth, their focus changes from the outside and from the people who are different to the people who are the same. So if you are a designer of engines, then you work with other designers of engines. And you look at the people down in manufacturing and say, boy, they look pretty stupid, don't they? I mean, what you get is an insularity and a changing reality. Little groups inside, these little specialist groups, start to experience a different reality from one another. And you breed contempt, right? You have what Peter talked about earlier, non-inclusion. Okay? There's a whole system of there's a whole social side to this as well. And I think it's maybe too big a model or too much to do all of the systems at one time, but it does work in that social arena too. Internal insularity, you get entitlement, and niche fillers come in as well. Niche fillers here, when you've got increasing domain, industry consolidation, the reorganization to get rid of the inefficiencies, industry consolidation, now you have mega banks, right? Where's the little bank when you need some help? And the niche fillers, my brother-in-law works for one of these little banks, and it's a niche filler. It's a little local community bank to do what the big ones won't do, right? That type of thing. So you also have niche fillers in here. They find ways to serve the larger field or web that is not served by the giants. So you've got in here, in this area, an arena, not just huge industry consolidation, now you also get the little niche fillers. We've got them in Boulder galore, which is where I live. And you'd expect that in Boulder, though, too. Very non-mainstream. And here they reconnect with the environment, et cetera. Okay, let me talk about the human side for just a moment. Sally Gerner, again, a colleague of mine, she wrote the first book on chaos and evolving ecological systems. She's writing another one now, which will be accessible by everybody. It won't be a hard science book. And it's a lot more about social systems, but this is just some of the things that she says here. Same thing. When you get to the top, when you think about social systems in this curve, at the very bottom of this is a society based on intent, on pure values, sticking to the core. This is Peter talked about this, sticking with the core values. And so you have the United States being the first country that was formed based on intent for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness instead of on ethnicity. Very first country to do this. All right? So you start down here. You spend time developing a coherent path and web. So how do we manage ourselves? How do we become an entity, a country? You have a constitution, you develop a Bill of Rights, all of those sorts of things. But before you can really have growth, you've got to develop infrastructure along the way. So here you're working based on intent, on aim, on values. And with growth, you put on infrastructure. And what happens at the top, and this happens to many religions as well, you start out, or maybe all religions, you start out down here, organized religion, you put on infrastructure, and at the top, it becomes ritualistic. It's the infrastructure, it's the pattern that you formed, that you shaped, that you stick with, and you've lost the intent, right? So you've lost intent, yes?
A lot of people always say, why is it more difficult to affect change in an old organization? And this is part of the thing. When you start a microbrewery, it's a lot easier to innovate than a brewery.
Right. So the question here is, explains a lot of why it's hard to change old existing organizations rather than to start up a new one. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is what John Whitney meant when he said change doesn't necessarily come from the top, it comes from the periphery in. Think about the niche fillers. Okay, periphery is where you begin to actually get back in touch with the environment, and you develop something small here off on the side that's filling a need that isn't being filled. Absolutely right. Right. Thank you. Systems-driven, ritualistic, up at the top. You get groups become insular because they have diverging realities inside this large infrastructure, and you get this let them eat cake, right? Because the reality of each different group becomes so different from one another, these specialist groups. No inclusion at all at this point in time, at the very top. You've become completely disconnected from one another. And it's a pattern that we've been going through over and over again. If you look at the Roman Empire, if you look at the United States, you look at any countries along the way, religions along the way, organizations, this is the type of pattern that we wind up falling into. I hope that by understanding the pattern, we can begin to avoid it. Right? It's nice to be able to look back and see that this is what's happened before and hopefully learn from it along the way. Oh, and here, very slow group learning. This slow group learning is because there are layers of social distance. So the people who are starving, when Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake, the people who are starving, well, there's low social learning or group learning throughout that society because of layers of social distance that dampen the urgency. So you may be the service engineer, Or you may be the salesperson who can see your customer not very happy at all with what's going on, but you have, again, these layers that dampen the urgency. To me, when I talk about all this, I have a very optimistic view, believe it or not, about all of this. Because if I look at the knowledge age, the thing that the knowledge age does is I want to say it reduces the friction. Friction, as in, here you have information at the very bottommost level, and there's all this friction in getting it up to the top. All this friction, distortion, and everything else. And so I look at knowledge age in enabling us to communicate in many different places and many different times is really a tremendous sign of hope that we can maybe beat this cycle and not fall into it if we can stay connected to one another. And so again, the US is one we were just talking about, development, a society of intent versus ethnicity, and the topping out we all experience personally, where the resources used by the government are greater than the value created, no longer playing a coherent role in the web, okay? It's small insular groups breed contempt for one another. We've got the Freemen, we've got Waco, we've got the Christian Coalition, and I'm not comparing them that way, I'm just saying they're very intact insular groups, not in touch with what the rest of society is doing. You've got the liberals, you've got all these different groups who are doing, this sort of thing at each other. There's no sense of commonality that our purpose is to play a larger role in the web. And the larger role is a society of intent. Okay, this one about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Structure over intent. You know all those people who hide in the woodwork and as soon as the dynamic leader leaves, resurrects the old policy manual, and the old systems and say, we need to use these, right? So that's this part about structure over intent. Okay, so what we've talked about so far, a couple of different things. We've looked at it, said this is a natural process that's going on. It's driven, not only is it just kind of going on happenstance, it's driven, and it's driven by huge energy disequilibriums. You'll recognize the word incommensuration in your notes. That's what it means. Okay, just huge energy disequilibriums. There are different dynamics going on at each one of these phases. We've talked a little bit about how one phase builds on the next phase. And let's see, and also as you go through this, you have increasing complexity or intricacy and increasing interdependence as you go through. The second principle that I want to talk about with this, in this context, is this one. In order to survive, any entity, in order to survive, must play a coherent role in the web of human interaction. Okay? Or you might want to put it in more business terms, the way I use it for my business students, and say the ongoing success of any free market enterprise is ultimately related to its ability to create value, something the consumer is willing to pay for. Okay? To me, translation, from science to business. And when I look at this, when I put this together in my head, to me, it gave new meaning to this picture. Okay? We've all seen it many, many times before. I've thought about it, this is really neat. It shows the interdependence inside the organization, and here is the customer, and here is the supplier, right? And they're all part of this larger system. I have new meaning for this now in my own head based on what we've just talked about, that this is a pattern of interaction of these individual elements all throughout, right? And it will exist as long as it serves the larger web. The larger web is everything out here, the larger context in which this sits. And it will only survive as long as it is serving that web. It will disappear otherwise. Right? So to me, in a sense, there is no such thing as a finite, concrete entity anymore. We're all a pattern of interaction. I want to say that about human bodies, too, is that, my body, as tangible as it seems to me and to everybody else, it's just a pattern of molecules that are interacting with one another. But it's as soon as it stops serving the web, right, I'm going to disappear and die and kind of decompose and all those good things, right? But I'm serving the web at this point in time. It's a pattern of interaction. There's nothing that's concrete and solid. So it's a very, very different view in my mind. And I talk about this with business students a little bit. And it's interesting because they still think of it this way, is that there is this organization which deserves to exist in of itself. And it's a solid entity and we serve it. No, it's not that way at all. You've got to change the whole focus of it and say it will only exist as long as it is serving. And even if it's not a free market enterprise, eventually places like the Soviet Union fall apart, right? It's not serving the larger web. It takes more energy to run it than it actually created value for the people who live there. Okay. We're moving right along. I think this will be the first time I actually finish my talk in the time allotted. Managerial implications on this. Let's talk about some of this now in terms of what it means for us. I don't know if you have it, and I'm sorry. First time I've talked about it, I won't tell you how many days I've worked on this in terms of organizing it. And I know it's still not perfect, and it's just first time out, it's highly inefficient, slow progress, right, in the development stage. Every entity exists as long as it creates value. That's it. You're not creating value, you will cease to exist. Okay? An entity is nothing more than a pattern of interaction, right? It's a pattern of interaction, processes, support structures that support this value creation. Patterns embody past learning and current limitations. This goes back to our early slide on systems, right? So a system passes on what you know, makes it easy to do the right thing, gives you efficiency, but at the end, it's the limitations to it that get you, okay? And every entity also changes what is valued. So as soon as you start to act in the system, in the larger web, what happens is you change how the web will value your product and your service as soon as you start to do it, right? That goes on throughout the entire life cycle of the entity. So in the beginning, they value it tremendously. At the end, it's marginalized. All solution and structures are doomed, right? Because they change what is valued, and they also, again, embody current limitations. So all structures doomed. There is no one best solution. There is no best management system. There is no best structure for your organization. That's it, okay? Given foregone conclusion. Don't even look for it. Yet managers are still looking in the machine-based mode for what's wrong, what's the one piece or one part that I could go in and change. Okay? Forget it. Requires continual tight connectivity to the external web. Right? Is when you again get into a growth stage, the focus turns not from survival, where you're keenly and acutely interacting with the environment, but in a growth situation, it's hard to screw it up. Okay? That's essentially, Deming used to say that about the United States after World War II. All these managers patting themselves on the back. And it's basically, it's hard to screw it up. Okay? It just takes off and goes on its own. So it's this continual tight connectivity to the external web is necessary because you're going to hit that topping out point, right, along the way. And I think perhaps one of the most crucial things myself, and this is this piece, the ability to move through different forms, is to not anchor ourselves personally and organizationally. Organizationally to a structure, personally to a career, a specific career path, a specific job. I'm a professor. You know, how safe do you think that is? You know, tenure track, gone. That'll be gone soon. So ability to move through different forms, and I think that, again, speaks to all of us. Other things then for managers, if this is what the reality is like, what is it we have to do as managers? This is a picture we may have discussed before, but it takes on, again, more meaning for me, is that if you look at what people do, the drivers of culture and behavior, so this is what's going on at the top of your iceberg, and also the culture, belief system, or paradigm that your organization has. In the beginning, in the development phase, it's right here. Okay, this is the development phase. It's leadership that really holds this group together. My husband's in a startup organization right now, and so I see it very clearly. I mean, his job is in there. He's in the trenches. He's providing some of the glue, some of the coupling, all right, enabling, it's mutualist, all of this, investing in people along the way. As you go through development and you go into growth, what happens is that the leadership role is less valued, right, within, and what becomes valued inside the organization is more structure. So you're moving over here, and you've got what's driving the organization is existing systems and culture. This would be more of your growth mode. So, and here is where you come into ritualistic behavior, letting the systems drive you as you top out, etc. It's the organizational systems. What happens is when you want to move from this topped out position to the next curve, if you want to change or you want to move through forms, you've got to move back down this way again. You basically have to have the willingness, and this is where Deming talked about it, to override the existing systems. Say, hey, that doesn't work, throw it out, check it out, right? And so you move back down over here when you're going into topping out and eventually into moving through to the next S-curve. Right? But this is, to me, a major role of what leadership begins to do. It works on systems and saying, let's get rid of these, I have the authority, power, we can do that. But also then, I want to say in leadership as well, keeping everyone included. This would be the soft side, the personal side of it, is keeping an inclusion culture instead of an exclusion culture. So that would be the other side of leadership too. One on systems and one in terms of intent and culture. The other thing about all of this, as we've looked at this is a complex role for leaders. I mean, are we asking for Superman? Well, maybe if we ask it all of one person, it's Superman. If we have the ability to move leadership like you have in teams, where you can rotate leadership, that type of thing, then this becomes less of a superhuman effort. I think we've got a ways to go till we get there, but I hope so. This is another piece that I found so interesting too, especially coming to a Deming conference. Changes the nature of relevant questions when you start looking at this S-curve for management. It's no longer competition or cooperation, okay? It's not an either-or sort of thing, right? There's no black and white. It's not efficiency or effectiveness, one or the other. It's not uniformity. Let me put in here standardization, right? Versus diversity. It's not either or. It changes the question, so it's more like, what's the structure of the dynamic that's going on? How do we do this? When do we do it? Where? How much? Right? Because we're going to be using all of this. And it's interesting because the more we go forward, the more we go back to the past. This is like yin and yang. It's not black and white. You need both parts of this thing that looks like a dichotomy. And again, Peter talked about this on the very first day. It's not a dichotomy. It's this or this. It's this integration and the ability to move back and forth between them. So some of the balance issues that we sometimes struggle with, efficiency and effectiveness, no final solution to this one. You've got to be able to go through and move through and use each one when it's effective, when it's appropriate. Individualism and coupling, yes, both. Not either or, yes, both. Competition and cooperation, yes, both. Right? And it's even stronger than this. It's not just cooperation. We're talking about mutualism. That's investing in the other person, in the other people around you. Standardization and diversity, yes, both. Right? Important in the growth phase, also important in the growth phase to prepare for the next phase. Okay? Specialists and generalists, yes, both. Right? Same thing, all the way along and through. So almost any list that you put together this way, you could say yes, both, through here. Some of the wins that we know, results and process, yes, both. It's not just process-oriented, it's both. Okay? You have to be able to move back and forth between them. Let me do a couple more things, and then we'll just open up for questions. This one struck me. The world is dynamic, and evolution is natural. Why is transformation so hard? And I think we've answered a lot of that in terms of the structure already, and that the structural issues overcome us. But the things that I want us to carry away from this is that it is inevitable. Transformation, moving from one curve to the next, the death of a given form, or let me say the marginalization of a given form, is inevitable. It's lawful, that it has a pattern to it. This is, again, the idea of chaos. It looks like chaos, but there are patterns within chaos. It's lawful, it's unpredictable. When it's going to happen, what is going to be the invention that takes off along the way, don't know. Okay? The pattern is and this is at the top, this is moving to the next S-curve. The pattern is a coming apart and a recycling of elements. Now, I'm going to say this would be, rather than building bloated structures with the expectation that you're going to have unlimited growth, that this form is the perfect form and it will serve the automotive industry for the next 50 years, okay, at least. It'll serve for the next 50 years, and you build on the structure. What you've got to do, if you can anticipate the fact that it will come apart, that it will top out, then you can, through attrition or through seeding other diverse areas, avoid this coming apart in an unplanned way. In an unplanned way, I want to say hostile takeovers, going out of business. Okay, this is the coming apart in an unplanned way. You'd like to do it in a planned way, with anticipating what the next stage is going to be. So this is the business as usual. This is the chainsaw L in an unplanned way, right, when he comes in, or hostile takeover. All of what he does is not bad. The way he does it is bad, right? So you need to recycle those elements. You don't need them there anymore. You need to be investing them in the next S-curve. In a planned mode, what we'd like to have is innovation and transformation. This is supporting diversity and experimentation along the way. And most managers actually will do this. They will support a little bit of, well, you want to try a little of that TQM stuff? Okay, well, okay. They'll give you a little bit of room. The part that I find that often they really miss is this piece. Successes, they must have the support and freedom from past limitations. So many of the change efforts are, that's fine, you want to tinker, you want to play, you want to do something a little bit different, we'll invest a little money, but they do it within these constraints, within our current system where we have control. So they want to carry over from the old into the new. Successes must have support and freedom, and they need to be selected by the web. What I meant by that is that I see so many companies that I work with that will have a new product or a new spin-off organization that is actually very successful, but the parent corporation will purposefully limit it, right? Well, Saturn, you can't build trucks because it would compete with GM. Or, Exabyte, one of the companies that I'm working with, is you're putting out together a 4mm tape. Well, that's going to compete with our main product, 8mm tape. Therefore, and so they don't get the positive feedback. The positive feedback is energy flowing through, right? And that's where you build momentum and you have growth. So they basically shoot themselves in the foot. Now, who said it today? It was wonderful, or yesterday, about you can shoot yourself in the foot, but just don't reload, right? Okay. So one of the things here, the same thing here, just don't reload, is understanding that this is the path to growth. It needs to be selected by the web. It needs to play, and it also needs to be able to couple with other entities along the way to play a coherent role in that larger web. So some of the things about moving from one S-curve to the next that we almost forbid in the way we currently go about it. You can't do this. I don't mean positive feedback like a larger paycheck, right? Often a manager who is successful gets a larger paycheck. Does he get a promotion? A real promotion where he has more power? Rarely. Because you've got, here's this guy who's doing things that are really weird and different. And are we going to promote him to a position where he or she has more power? Rarely do I see that happen. It's like, be successful down here, right? And we'll give you more pay. So this piece, tied to, they're very, very rarely free from past limitations. They don't have the ability to be selected by the web, and they don't give them the support that's necessary to couple all the way along and through. Okay, let me wind up here, and there's like a ton more to say. And I think I'm going to have to let you ask questions to begin to reach into it. Let me just sort of wrap up some of these things, though, here. Past, I'm going to say, assumes a fixed pi. This is the mode we're coming out of again. You've reached the top. And instead, I want to talk about a creationist dynamic world, is that there isn't a carrying capacity to the world. There isn't one, all right? As long as we keep inventing and moving forward, we'll find ways, because one carrying capacity is essentially the limits set by the given technology. Profitability comes from competition, right? To instead, I want to say, playing a coherent role, creating value. So this should look very familiar to all we've talked about in terms of Deming, et cetera. Management, they like fixed structures and clear rules. It's their means for control. Instead, I want to say working with the natural patterns that are there, knowing there are going to be times where it's very free form, other times where you do need structure and roles. And balance, the ability to move back and forth between those different dynamics, between competition, cooperation, standardization, diversity, and it's an and situation rather than an or. People, cogs, interchangeable cogs. The part that's listed here, we really haven't talked about very much. It's something that Susan, though, alluded to a lot. Active, evolving agents, right? This piece is that we're not cogs, we're not machines with fixed, limited capacity, like your car has a designed end capacity, stable, static. That's not us, right? We are part of this universe which is active and continually evolving, and we are agents. This is the piece that she was talking about, is that these curves, they're created by our action, nobody else's. So these curves that you see for societies and organizations, that's us. Each and every one of us. Leaders don't do it by themselves. It's more like the treadmill, where you have, again, you start walking, you build up momentum, and then the momentum carries you. That's exactly what we do. So this is I think, an incredibly important piece and another talk. Relationships from dominant and hierarchical instead to mutualist, collaborative, and fine-grained. Fine-grained, where you get away from huge pipes of information, where you get only your information from the top comes down with the newsletter. Okay? Or what the management sees at the top is what comes up through their information system. Fine-grained is much closer to each other, in much closer connection to one another, fine-grained interactions. So it's not that you learn about your customers through what the newsletter says, but you have time, face-to-face time with your customers. You have time with others walking in the hallway to begin to talk to them and get their different perspectives. If you don't have a fine-grained perspective, you also...
Just a statement to pass along, and if you don't like it, just say interesting and I'll understand. The professor had opportunity to try and pin him down on things black and white, and we were talking about balance between the two and the need to work between them. Made me think of this. And he said, Gary, the world isn't black and white. And he paused and waited for me to say, which I did, yeah, I know, it's gray. I've learned that. He says, no, it's not gray either. He said, Gary, it's colorful. And
yes.
It's just, it's impacted me, and it came to my mind, so I want to use that if you want to. Big question, though.
I like that, by the way. Go ahead.
It wasn't interesting, huh? What thoughts have you had, and you touched on it just a little, about moving us along to the next S? Are you far enough along yet in this? Because obviously you're still developing some of your thoughts and things to make some suggestions so we don't fall into some of the same traps, or that we can at least lead through some of the patterns that are there. We can get through them quickly, more efficiently.
This, not to make the answer too long, but some of the things that I think are important is investing early here where you have all of this largesse, in a sense, that's coming out, and it's probably, about up in here somewhere on the curve. And investing that in diversity, in things that might take you forward, rather than what actually happens up here, and perhaps even over here, is it gets really sick, and you start building monuments you start taking your money and building huge monuments to the past management, the past leadership, And rulers have done that for eons, where this is when a lot of the great, again, monuments, pyramids, Rome, a lot of the things are built here. So I think one is investing in here. And the others is when you try to optimize, optimize and have no waste and have the most smoothly running, efficient system, you can do that. But what you've done is create a system that has no flexibility in it, no ability to move back and forth and adapt. And so the other thing that I think about in here as well is that there's a reason for some slack in the system and for some diversity in the system. A perfectly running machine may be optimal for the time that you designed it, which was maybe 5 years ago. And it's already not optimal now. And if it's optimal, it would be for a second, a fraction of a second, because everything keeps on changing. So you're going to need some flexibility in your systems. Don't worry about optimization. And I think the leadership component and building, let me say, healthy community becomes very important. I would say that the industrial age was not a healthy community. It was cogs, and we brought up and developed cogs through the education system and created dependence on the worker, on management. It was just this dependent relationship. But along the lines of building healthy community, I think would be the things that really enable you here. And what information age will do for you is it's going to enable us to stay smaller. Instead of building an organization with 100,000 or 500,000 people, you can have small entities that can do a lot. What a small entity of 50 to do what 5,000 used to do before, right? Those small entities now have the capability, the possibility to stay connected with one another, unfiltered, fine-grained type of interaction. And I think the healthy community is probably, with all of its diversity and everything else in it, it's probably the number one thing to being able to move from one area to the other. And I also think it's important for one last reason is that Toffler was talking about this the other day, and he was talking about perhaps the fourth wave will be the genetic revolution. And that scares the living daylights out of me. And if we don't have healthy community, we're really in trouble then, okay? If you get Science News, their last Science News was really interesting about what they've been doing with, genes, chromosomes, whatever, on a Drosophila, a little fruit fly. They figured out which chromosome grows wings. And so they have this picture of a Drosophila, a little fruit fly in Science News with a wing growing out of its eyeball. And you go, oh, how lovely. And it's, again, I think community, if we need it now, but man, we need to do it real quick and soon because the next wave won't be that far behind. And I think it will be much more important then than it is now. Yes? Go ahead.
Thanks. It struck me that I have a comment, but I wanted to reflect on this S-curve phenomenon. With your diagram there and your example of telephones and mobile phones, it seems like the next curve, the technology for the next curve is in existence already. It's just that it's real tough to figure out which one that is. And like you said, it might be genetics now. Who would have known when the internet was first being developed that it would be as big as it is today, like it's going to have the impact it is.
Right, right.
The comment I just had an insight as you were speaking is that you showed the slide about Darwinism as survival of the fittest.
Right.
And after hearing you speak, it seems to me like Lawtonism is also survival of the fittest, but you have a real different definition of what fit is.
With this, yes, fit is the ability to play a coherent role in the web, as versus fittest as in I'm stronger than you and therefore can beat you and eat you, okay? So it's, it's a definition of what fittest is. Yes, go ahead, please.
It's a really interesting, stimulating presentation. What I'm going to say is going to change the content of the presentation. From my understanding of Darwin, I think it's wrong
Okay.
to use it to illustrate the law of the jungle.
Okay.
It's like this. You talked about the importance of taking advantage of the differences. Now that is quintessentially what Darwin was all about. theory of evolution is about the process of natural selection. So the survival of an organism depends on its ability to respond and adapt to a changing environment. That's the same for an organisation. It needs to be an open system, there needs to be innovation, there needs to be improvement in order to evolve.
Right.
So I think Darwin has a good fit
Right.
with them because Darwin is not about destruction, it's about creation. It's a creation.
Can I add to that too? Is that, and that's a little bit of shaky ground, because a lot of what Darwin might have talked about versus how it was interpreted and carried on. And what was interpreted and carried on by the social community, by the elite of the time, was the war model. Okay. Yes, rule 4 of the funnel. Interesting. Okay, right. So but what shaped it, so what I'm saying is that in the industrial age, what shaped our thinking was our perception of Darwin as survival of the fittest, red in tooth and claw. Okay, so that was our perception of it, not the foundational work of it. Good point. Thank you.
Barbara. First, I'd like to thank you for stretching our minds and I think continuing Dr. Denham's legacy. And I did feel optimistic when I was going to come up to the microphone. Now I'm not sure. But my optimism comes from the idea that something I'd like you to confirm if you ever heard Dr. Denham say. I heard him ask the question when he was alive, was there any company that had fully implemented Dr. Denham's philosophy? His answer typically, what I recall seeing, was no, not one, something to that degree. Now, what I haven't heard him say, and I heard it secondhand that he has said, is someone asked him, in 20 years, how many companies do you think will have implemented your philosophy? And he said, all of them. And I was really, I thought about it, and the only thing that finally made sense is these curves, and that is, at some point in time, what was no longer will be.
Right.
Maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 50 years. But that's what I got from it, was this inevitability of Dr. Deming's philosophy, at least for myself. And lastly, this is sure gave a lot of meaning, which you described, to the whole idea that management is prediction, and how important that seems to me now. And also the system must be managed. I think those two things mean a lot more after listening to your talk. So it's a comment and a question.
I had not heard Deming say that in 20 years everybody would be doing it, but it will determine who survives and who doesn't, as the people who do change what they're doing, change what is successful. When I say an entity by its action changes what's valued, it means it changes what is successful. So you start having entities, as long as they can have enough positive feedback to really influence what's going on, then they will set the stage, and those that were working in the old way won't make it. But about companies that are doing this, here's one company that really impressed me, and they're not doing all of Deming by any means, but one thing that they are doing very well, and this is the ability to move through different forms, saying that no one form will be there for a long time. And this, at least, is on the planning stages, and in the evolutionary stages for them is HP. And HP, they think about their organization as the Hollywood model. And let me explain that. The Hollywood model being when you are doing a movie, what you do is you construct a set, you shoot the movie, and you break it down. And they're saying that's the way we need to operate our business, is that we want to be able to have enough things always in the pipeline so we can build a business, fill the need, break it down. But if we don't have we don't have this going on and the ability to do this, then what we lose is our people. And they said the most important thing we have as HP is core competence and a meta process for building up, running it, and breaking it down. I thought, oh, very good. They've as a company impressed me all the way along and through. But I thought that would fit real well with what we were talking about here too.
I admit to having a hard time buying into the S-curves, and especially the S-curves standing on each other's heads. It seems to me that we're all in the middle of a beginning and in the middle of a middle and the middle of an end.
Yes.
All the time.
Yes.
So, to me, the Toffler idea is really a look in the rearview mirror rather than a look forward. You can kind of stand from where we are, and we can look back and we can say, yes, there was a hunting and gathering age, and then there was an agricultural age, and then there was an industrial age, but I don't think that necessarily puts the information age in the bag yet.
Well, I don't think it puts the information age in the bag, but I think it sure gives us a pattern to work from. And to me, this is the same thing. The same thing is, well, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but it's also, to me, very much like special causes and common causes. How could you, Deming would say that you'll never know. There's no such thing really as a special cause. What there is an operational definition that we develop for a special cause. And it depends upon where you draw the boundaries of the system that you're monitoring, whether something is common cause or is it special cause. So it's a mental model of how things operate. And so we're very comfortable right now with defining a process and defining what we are going to call a special cause, which is something outside of a controlling it, right? Is it a special cause? We'll never know. And it depends which circle you look in, which boundary. You're looking at this process or you're looking at this process. This process is the special cause, this one is common cause, right? So to me, it's the same thing here. It's, you're right, we're moving through this, it's a fractal concept. We're moving through this on many different levels all the times, but I hope it gives some interpretive value to what you see going on around you. And it gives you some way to anticipate also what the different stages are so you can begin to plan for them. So management's prediction. To me, this has some predictive value, especially because we're getting to a stage where we're going through cycles, not in terms of 10 generations, but we're going through a phase where yours or my field may rise in the course of our lifetime and top out and go down in the course of our lifetime. So we're experiencing numerous cycles now within one lifetime. And I think that's important to understand and gives us some ability to adapt and to adjust to explain what's happening around us. So that's what I see as the value of it. It's I'm not saying Toffler is right at all. It's something that he commonly uses, and it's one way to look at it. I don't care what you label the different ones so much.
Let me just ask you this then. Okay. Dr. Deming said that a system must have an aim and that a system must be managed, and that he was pretty loose as to what the boundaries of that system were.
Right.
He said that Japan was a system, but the larger you make the system, the more difficult the leadership role becomes.
Right.
And I would think that what you refer to, the web, is something that we ought to try to control,
No.
that we ought to try to lead, that we ought to set an aim for,
Okay.
rather than having just a simple sort of laissez-faire free market approach to the web that, in fact, we can have some sort of impact on it and lead it.
I would say rather than control, participate in, because there is no one controlling force. There is no one brain cell. Your body's a web. There's no one master brain cell that controls all others. And actually, it's the interaction of all of the cells, all of them, not just your brain cells, but all throughout, that determine what happens. And so I think this idea of a system must be managed, I think I would now interpret that as saying, I essentially need to manage myself, right, in terms of the actions that I take and how I can choose how I respond to things. And I could go into this competition mode at the top of the S-curve, or I could really advocate and move towards, through my own action, let's move beyond this top part and competition, et cetera. So to me, that managing, I think, comes down to participation and leadership, so citizenry and leadership. Managing a system might be, that's the number one thing, I think, is the most powerful thing we could do. And then secondly, managing a system would be, for example, saying, we're going to take this policy manual that worked for us in the past, but it's no longer useful, and get rid of it. And so that might be more of what managing is. The web is the universe, and it's the same thing. Web is another word for system, okay?
Right.
A very interdependent
Right.
system. And same thing, whether you draw the circle around a small process, or do you draw it around your department or your organization or your country or your world or the universe, well, I don't think we should try to manage it, but we should play our role as an active agent.
But the
with
difference is the
consciousness.
aim. The difference is the aim, isn't it? I mean, we choose the aim.
Okay, I have a hook coming here and tracking me off. So why don't we, I'm here. Let's kind of come on up and ask questions, and we'll do it that way. Thank you.